Folks, we have one of the biggest balance patches I've ever seen in Hearthstone. Demon Hunter nerfs, Rogue nerfs, tons of other nerfs, Warrior nerfs, and buffs. Buffs for Paladin and Shaman. This is one of the craziest patches I've ever seen.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
So, lots to talk about, but let's start here with the nerfs. And I think most people will be excited or maybe relieved to see this one. Priestess of Fury going from 7 health down to 5, which is pretty substantial, I think. 5 is a much easier breakpoint for many people to deal with. That puts it in range of a handful of different spells. I think perhaps even more importantly is just minions are more readily able to trade into Priestess of Fury. If you have, a 5/2 that survives the Priestess of Fury play, suddenly you can trade right back in and you're good to go. There are rush minions like Evasive Worm that suddenly become perfect at answering cards like Priestess of Fury, and that's something that pops into the meta a lot with different lackeys and dragon decks. So, those are just a couple examples, but there's a lot across the game where this just becomes so much easier to respond to. It is a little bit worse against, with Soul Mirror, I guess, for Priest. Priest liked having the more health for Soul Mirror so that it survived and pinged off the other one. They get a Priestess of Fury, so they lose that little trick. So maybe Priest isn't happy about this, but I think everybody else is thrilled to see this at a lower health point. Now, at 5 health, I do think Priestess of Fury still remains competitive. That's still a pretty reasonable stat line. It's still big and nasty. And the most important thing is you're still getting the effect, right? You're playing it, you're getting that 6 damage, which is where the real value comes from. You're still forcing a reaction from your opponent. This has that kind of taunt aspect where you have to kill this thing or it's just going to snowball. So easier to deal with, less powerful, but still a strong card. Now, to be fair, a lot of Temple Demon Hunters have already cut Priestess of Fury. It's kind of been this back and forth, just depending on the day, depending on the meta. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it in? Is it out? This will make it less likely to see, but I think it's still a competitive card, particularly in any deck that trends towards more mid-range or more kind of big demon stuff, which some demon hunters do. Certainly, I think it's still a viable option and a powerful card, but way more easy to deal with and ultimately a great change. Moving on here to Crimson Sizzle Runner going down to 1 attack from 2 attack. So another small change here, but a significant one. This makes the Crimson Sizzle Runner much worse to play on turn 1, where it stops contesting things like Blazing Battle Mages or Flame Imps, right? We saw this already happening before with the Sludge Slurper in Shaman. Taking that from a 2/1 to a 1/1 really hurt its play. It's already been reverted back because it kind of killed the card too much. And I think we'll see that Crimson Sizzle Runner does get notably worse as well as an early game card. Now, of course, I think as a mid-game card or a refill card, even late in the game where you top deck this, you're still going to be quite happy to play this. The fact that it's cycling into something new so affordably while still depositing your body makes this still a good card. It's still playable. Most lists are not going to be willing to cut this because of that difference. It's not going to have that same Sludge Slurper impact, but it just will be weaker on turn 1, which means, again, it's a good change because it remains viable, remains competitive, it doesn't kill the card, but it reduces the power level of Demon Hunter overall, and that's what we're looking for, right? So, fantastic change here with Crimson Sizzle Runner. This card was way too good before. This makes it a little bit more reasonable because it has less power early, kind of hurting half the time you might want to play it, and that's a really good thing to see. Next up here, moving to Rogue, we've got Shadow Jeweler Hanar going from 5 to 4 health. I think this is namely to make this easier to kill in the early game where the Rogue might just brazenly drop this on turn 2 and expect it to live knowing that 5 health was impossible to deal with. 4 health a little bit more accessible. Also just makes it less likely to stick so that it gets multiple turns worth of value. It's going to be rare where that difference makes a big impact on a game, but it's occasional enough that this does, again, very marginally pull down the power level of Hanar, which again is exactly what we're looking for. I think that's a good subtle change. You wouldn't want to maybe increase the mana cost too much and really change the function of the card. Just making it a little bit easier to respond to while still retaining all of the same sort of efficiencies and upsides that existed before. So again, just tiny tweaks to the power level of classes is great. I think this is a very welcome change to Hanar. Moving on here to Blackjack Stoner. Cost and stats staying the same, but the effect here is changed from making the minion that it saps costing 2 more, and instead it will now only cost 1 more. So not quite that freezing trap tempo punish, but still does do a little more than a sap because it does increase the mana cost. And I think this is very reasonable. We all saw how crazy Blackjack Stoner was going to be. It was pretty obvious this card was nuts. If secrets ever got played, they did. So this card has been nuts. And that 2-mana discount made it really hard to ever replay those cards, right? It's just like, oh, I can't spend an extra 2 mana on this thing. It almost never makes sense. Plus, with things like even a Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, it would make it unplayable, which was especially problematic. Now, anything that's at 9 mana still remains playable. Some of those 10 mana cards do still get pushed to 11. But nonetheless, this does really allow the opponent who's getting sapped here, is getting stunned or whatever, to replay that card in a more efficient way and kind of push back a little when it comes to counter tempo instead of being stuck with just a completely dead card in their hand. I think that's going to make a pretty big difference. I still think Blackjack Stoner is the nuts. This is still going to be played, as is the case with all the cards so far, which is fine. But I mean, this could have probably just been a sap that didn't cost anything extra. You could just remove that final sentence where it doesn't cost more, and this would still be a good card because sap was already great, and this is sap on a stick that's even more efficient. And we know that secrets are a viable option in Rogue, so you didn't really need to boost the power level of this one. I have a feeling they were like, man, we need to make sure secrets are good, and Blackjack Stoner will help do that. Now we know the secret package kind of makes sense already. I mean, certainly that's partly because of Blackjack Stoner's power, but I think it would be fine even just as a sap. That's still a really big tempo swing and a hyper efficient play. So this card to me remains nuts, a little less nuts, but still very, very strong. And I think Secret Rogue package will stick around for a while thanks to Still Hanar and this one being really competitive. Moving over to Warrior here, we have the Blood Boil Brute going from 6 attack down to 5 attack. This is, of course, popular in the sort of Enrage style warrior that's been tier 1 for the last week or two and has been pretty good the whole expansion. Just took a while to get discovered by a vast majority of the player base. And again, very subtle change here. I think Blood Boil Brute remains really good at 5 attack. It's still trading favorably into most things when it's played for Rush. The discount remains the same. All that's fine. So it's still just as efficient. It's just how often is that 6 versus 5 damage going to make a difference? Very rarely. So I think Blood Boil Brute stays good. Just maybe shaves off 0.5% here and there of the win rate. And that's a wonderful welcome change. So still a good card. Still going to help empower those crazy risky skipper turns for Warrior. I think the real power card for Warrior has been Battle Rage and Risky Skipper. So I'm a little shocked neither of those got addressed. Particularly Battle Rage is a classic card. They used to love changing classic cards. But going in a different direction here, Blood Boil Brute is one of the big payoff cards. So reducing its spike potential a little is nice. And I guess as it lingers around on board after it takes a trade, it is dealing a little bit less face damage as well. So maybe that challenges the ability for this deck to end games. Although again, I think they usually have excess damage. It's not a big problem. So a very good subtle change. So next up here is the Bloodsworn Mercenary, a card I never thought we'd see nerfed, but the other part here of the Warrior nerfs, it's going from a 3/3 down to a 2/2. So really one of the more significant nerfs in a lot of ways, because on a 3-mana minion, changing a third of its stats there is really significant. Priestess of Fury also lost 2 total stats, but as a percentage of its total stats, much lower, right? This was a third of all the stats for Bloodsworn Mercenary. So I do think this makes the card notably weaker, but the way it's utilized often is as a combo finisher enabler where you do something like Kor'kron Elite, Inner Fire, and then you use your Bloodsworn Mercenary to copy the Kor'kron and deal tons of damage, right? So there are instances, of course, where you're happy to play this for a tempo card, like with your Bomb Wrangler and a Risky Skipper turn, right? You want to get an extra Bomb Wrangler. So it did matter that it was a 3/3 in some cases in those more mid-game turns, but I think a lot of its utility remains regardless of its stats. You care more about the thing it's copying than the body itself. So I don't think this kills Bloodsworn Mercenary despite the severity, perhaps, of the stat change. Percentage-wise, I think it's still a pretty good card. It's just, again, going to make Enrage Warrior a little weaker, and that's a great change. I know I'm kind of repeating myself a lot here, but these are all really subtle, small changes that make positive impacts on the meta. It's just good stuff and very reasoned changes. I'm really happy so far. Next up here is Imprisoned Scrap Imp, popular, of course, in Scrap Imp hand zoos, I guess you'd call them. In particular, very powerful because of Expired Merchant into Hand of Gul'dan, drawing you a ton of cards and then buffing all those cards with Imprisoned Scrap Imp, often very cheap minions that are played very quickly, and just overwhelm in the mid game where most decks just don't have answers to those gigantic boards. Scrap Imp going from a +2/+2 buff down to a +2/+1 buff, so basically reducing the total available health pool from those buffed boards. And that's important. That gives so many decks better answers to these, whether it's their own minions on board, just taking better trades, or any kind of future removal spell. Instead of something having 4 health, now it has 3, and Penance can answer that, right? There's all kinds of different decks and examples where that makes minions a little bit easier to deal with. So I do think this reduces the power spike nature of Imprisoned Scrap Imp. I think this will still be a card that has a crazy win rate when drawn and played early in combination with those big hands. So it could still be problematic. One could almost argue to push this down to 1-1 instead of 2-1, I think. But that's a good start, and let's see how this goes. It might be enough to make the difference and reduce those bad feeling moments. I still don't like the kind of binary nature of that deck and this card, where it's either like they completely blow you out or you just run over them because they didn't hit the nuts. It's not a good Hearthstone experience in most cases. So there is perhaps a little bit of fundamental design flaw in this card, I think. But, you know, if the numbers are right, that can go away, or it can at least be mitigated, and this is a step in the right direction. I do think it's more important to change the health than the attack, so that was a good decision, but I wonder if it is quite enough. I guess we'll see when this one's played. I'm kind of hopeful, maybe a little doubtful, but I think this is a fine start. Moving on here to Hunter, we have Scavengers Ingenuity. Now is going to only give a +2/+2 buff instead of a +3/+3 buff. And this is a great change. Scavengers Ingenuity felt nuts from the very beginning. A tutor with this enormous buff, card draw in a class that lacks it. That was all just way too much. And the minions that would result out of this were absolutely crazy big, right? Just think about like the 7/4 Diving Griffins. Those take such crazy trades, leave behind a 7 attack minion. That's nuts. Now it'll go down to 3 health on the Diving Griffin. Everything else gets a little smaller off of this too. The Zixors are only 6/6s instead of 7/7s. I don't know if that matters much. But it's the early game minions that are played out early that take really favorable trades. Even if it is a Zixor, non-Zixor prime, right? It's a little smaller as well. So all in all, I think that does make the minions drawn here a little bit more palatable for other decks to deal with. And this is a good change. This is just a really strong card. It needed to be addressed. I'm glad they didn't tweak the mana cost again. If you push this to 3, it would almost absolutely kill the card, because Hunter already has a lot of 3 mana plays that they like to do. Diving Griffin, Zixor are good examples. Animal Companions, weapons, etc. So it needs to be at 2 mana, so you had to change the effect here. I'm glad that, by the way, Blizzard hasn't been stuck on only mana cost changes with these balance updates. It's been mostly stats, which I think is way, way more flexible, better to tweak than mana, less universal and less punishing. So another really, really needed and fantastic change here. So now let's head over to some buffs. Lurker below, for instance, going to 5 health from 3. That's kind of crazy. Basically makes it a fire elemental that can hit multiple minions instead of only one. Of course, it still can't go face. But this is a good change. I mean, I thought Lurker below was already okay, but in playing it in the last week a little bit, testing with it, it did feel bad at 3 health. There was a lot of times it died to just really small, easy stuff. So I think 5 health makes this that stickier swing card that you're looking for, where it's more likely to actually stick around and maybe take another trade, or maybe even go like 3 for 1, 4 for 1, 5 for 1, where it's killing multiple minions and absorbing maybe a couple removal spells or another extra minion trade, basically, which is really, really good. So keep an eye on this card. I think it's actually going to be a really, really powerful option for Shaman. Of course, it's only a 1-of as a legendary, so you can't ever maybe define a deck or anything, but I imagine this is the sort of thing you toss in or feels really good in Highlander or Quest decks as a very, very powerful option. Eventually, if not right away, because I don't know if Shaman's still good enough, but this card will someday make a big impact. And still in Shaman, we have Shattered Rumbler going up to 5 attack from 4 attack. A nice change. I'm glad to see it, but ultimately, I don't think this really helps the Shattered Rumbler much. I've been playing around with this one a lot lately, too. And the real problem for me with Shattered Rumbler is that it hits your own minions. It hits friendly stuff, so it kills your own totems, any other minions you want to play in the same turn. It all dies because of the Shattered Rumbler. I don't think 1 attack really helps that. It was already pretty solid stat line as a 4/6. It already had a good effect dealing with enemy stuff. It's just like, well, it didn't change the fact that it punishes you sometimes. So for me, Shattered Rumbler, it might still be a good card for the record eventually. Like, I think there are some cool quest options with this. It's still a great swing card on those smaller boards. It's great against things like Demon Hunter with all their 2 health minions. So if it was ever going to be good, I don't think this made it like any better. It's just marginally higher attack, which I don't think really impacts the style of card all that much. So basically, its sort of vector is the same that it was. The vector may still be good or bad. It's hard to say. I think eventually good. Actually, this card has some potential down the road. But this buff probably didn't really help change that, certainly in the short term, and didn't really change whether or not this card was going to work. So the final Shaman change here is Torrent going down to 4 mana from 5 mana, which means that if you actually discount this, it goes down to 1 mana for dealing 8 damage, which is crazy. And I already thought Torrent was pretty solid. The condition's not that hard to meet in Shaman. It did line up very well, dealing with some very big stuff. And now meaning that you're going to kill stuff that affordably and make counter tempo plays, or you do something else with all your spare mana is awesome. So I think this took a card that was already potentially very good, just kind of lying in wait until it got to realize that potential, made it even better. So it's just going to be more likely to discover that potential, more likely to make a big impact. And it could help Shaman get off the ground. I don't know if these 3 changes are enough for Shaman right now. I think it would still need more than this, but setting it for the future, these cards do a lot, and they're all pretty solid, I think. So Shaman may not get there this expansion, but it's going to have some very powerful tools moving forward on the backs of cards like this. And then finally here, one last buff, Aldor Attendant, going from a 2 mana 2/3 down to a 1 mana 1/3. Same effect here. This is awesome. Blizzard has already buffed one previous Libram card. They obviously want Libram Paladin to be a thing. I love it because I want it to be a thing too. And this helps. Paladin's really short on 1-drops right now. I actually experienced that today trying to build a deck. There's just nothing for 1 that you're excited to do. This becomes a really, really good 1-drop, right? 1 mana 1/3 is perfect. It's what you need to start the game, start trading into your opponent's stuff. And this also means if you happen to have like 2 Librams of Wisdom in your hand next turn, you can play them both on your Aldor Attendant, and you can make it even bigger to take some nice 3/5 trades as well, right? That's kind of the perfect scenario opening hand. But it showcases what's possible, right? If you had 2 of these, you could play an Aldor Attendant and Aldor Attendant again on turn 2, and then buff both of them with 0 mana Librams. So there are some pretty crazy early game opportunities, but even outside of those like exact scenarios, it's still a more flexible minion. You can toss it into a turn later in the game too. You know, you have 6 mana, you can play this and your other Aldor, and you know, you just get a little extra body, you accelerate those discounts on your Libram. So all in all, a really good change to help that deck get moving in the early game, make it more flexible in the late game. Basically, this kind of pays for itself immediately if you have any Libram that's playable in hand, whereas before, you know, you spent 2 to get a 1 mana discount. Now you spend 1 to get a 1 mana discount, so it's even faster. I think this is an awesome change. Is it enough to get Libram Paladin off the ground? I actually don't think alone this will do it. It will help. It will make the deck, you know, instead of like maybe a tier 4 deck, a tier 3 deck, but it's not going to like skyrocket this to great success, unfortunately. But I like the Blizzard's paying attention and looking out for Libram Paladin. I think that's really, really cool, and this is a good change. So there you have it, folks. Those are the nerfs and buffs. So many cards to talk about here. It's crazy how much stuff got changed. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on these. What did you think was a welcome change? What surprised you? What's a terrible change? Did anything else need to be nerfed? Are you absolutely in love with these? I'm generally very, very happy with what we saw here. Great subtle changes, just pulling down the power level of some decks while trying to push up the power level of others. That's going to shake up the meta a little bit. Of course, all these variables changing means something's going to look a little different. So it keeps the game fresher, pulls down Demon Hunter some. I love it. I think it's one of the best balance changes we've ever seen. So you're welcome to disagree. I'm curious to hear those thoughts if you do. But if you agree, you know, maybe share some love with Blizzard. They deserve it from time to time. So I like these changes, but what do you think? Share that in the comments below. Until then, though, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, game on.